Russia is not in a great place right now, which has led to an increasing expectation that Putin is done. And while that is still quite a reach, I think it is worth exploring what would happen if Putin were to ever fall from power. Indeed, the consequences immediately raise questions about the best time for that to happen from Ukraine's and the broader Western perspective. It is tempting for the Ukrainian side to say that sooner is obviously better. And I do not want to convince you otherwise, given that every day spent at war is another day of costs incurred on the battlefield and on civilian targets. But there are some subtle concerns about the timing of a potential Putin departure that will have some not-so-subtle long-run consequences, not only for Russia, but also Ukraine and the rest of the world. So today, we will explore this situation in 3 steps. First, I will give you an overview of the many ways that Putin could leave office. Then we will head off to a historical parallel, the fall of the Soviet Union, which will offer some critical insights regarding today's problem. Finally, we will look at the key differences between how Trump or a future president might handle the situation. It turns out that the post-Putin world will offer an opportunity for the West, but it will be an expensive one, which raises questions about whether the current administration will use the opportunity in the same way that a successor might. But let's begin with an overview of Putin's potential problems. I do not want to go into depth about the overall situation, because that has been a recurring theme across both of my channels over the last couple of weeks. The basic summary is that Russia's economic situation is not looking good for the purposes of continuing the war effort. However, your average Russian citizens are still doing fine. The group that is getting soaked is the oligarch class, as they are losing business deals with the West and are de facto paying for all of the wage increases going to those average Russians via greater demand for labor. Consequently, I mentally file this problem as elevated for Putin, and certainly elevated compared to where we were at the beginning of the year. But I would like to remind everyone that the economic situation in Iran is substantially worse. There were real anti-government protesters on the streets there only a few months ago, and the public perception is that the Iranian government is not about to go anywhere. So place your perception of the Putin situation as lower than that. To wit, the prediction markets put the odds of the fall of the Iranian regime by June 30th at 5%. For Putin, it is 2%. Note further that Putin is 73 years old, so some of that percentage is reflecting natural causes. Nonetheless, let's just say that the fall happens. Then what? There is a public perception that the war is unpopular in Russia. The new leader, not weighed down by the same political baggage as Putin, will withdraw, and we can close this silly chapter of geopolitical history. Well, not so fast. Continuation of the war seems to be getting less popular among the Russian population, and maybe it is outright unpopular in the aggregate. But shrinking Russia's de facto status quo borders will draw a fundamentally mixed reaction from that same group. Remember that the annexation of Crimea was incredibly popular in Russia. Even the late Alexei Navalny, perceived as the great Free Russia hope, did not support simply handing Crimea back to Ukraine for a good portion of his career. There is no consensus between the West and the modal Russian citizen regarding what international borders ought to look like. The question in Russia is a matter of how costly it is to expand. With Crimea, it was virtually free. Continuing in the Donbass, on the other hand, is considerably more expensive. And simply giving back territory to Ukraine? Absolutely not. That would be a great way for Russia's next leader to immediately be removed from power. In other words, the West should be expecting what it might describe as a hardliner to replace Putin. Now, there are a couple of ways that this could end more positively for Ukraine. One is that Russia descends into a civil war with Putin no longer in power. His absence creates a vacuum, and various factions arise, all trying to wrestle control over the Kremlin. We know how this works from World War I. Russian troops return home to pick sides in the Civil War, and Russia's international opposition can exploit their military advantage. The other way is if a moderate comes to power. This is more likely if Putin's fall is via a social movement, again with the caveat that right now, the oligarchs are the ones frustrated with him. By moderate, once more, I do not mean someone who actively wants to return to January 2022 borders. I mean someone who cares about Russia's fiscal position and places less value on a Nova Russia vanity project. This person will not simply give eastern Ukraine back to Kyiv, but they might be willing to part ways with it for the right price. And that takes us to today's historical parallel: the fall of the Berlin Wall, the reunification of Germany, and the end of the Soviet Empire. With so many decades having passed since the saga happened, it is easy to think that Reagan said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Then the wall fell, the Soviet Union said goodnight, and Eastern Europe went home happy. If only. The Kremlin had decided that it could no longer afford to run the empire that defined the Cold War period. But there was a huge difference between relaxing Moscow's hierarchical structure over Eastern Europe and watching Western powers march forward without objection. Like everything else Cold War related, Germany was at the center of the conflict. It became clear that West Germany and East Germany would reunify. More precisely, though, the East would fold into the West. One slight problem. West Germany had joined NATO in 1955. If territory formerly known as East Germany was now a part of the Federal Republic of Germany, that would make ex-East Germany part of NATO. Good luck figuring out how that would work when about 400,000 Soviet soldiers were still stationed there, plus about 200,000 of their support staff and dependents. This was far from the harmonious period that history textbooks make it out to be. The United States even began drawing up war plans on how to unstick the Soviet Union from the territory. But war is inefficient, and a range of peaceful settlements exist that ought to make both parties better off. The key breakthrough came when George H.W. Bush suggested that Germany's deep pockets could solve the problem. You see, at the time, the Soviet Union was in an economic tailspin. It turns out that command economies are not so great at creating wealth. Having large oil and gas deposits made up the difference for the Soviet Union for a long time. But by that point, energy prices were sagging. The Soviet Union was on its last legs. Thus, Germany offered substantial economic concessions to the Soviet Union. This ranged from interest-free loans to rebuild the Soviet economy, to direct payments to build new facilities for the returning Soviet troops. The total package was worth about $14 billion at the time. In return, the Soviet Union withdrew its troops from East Germany and did not try to interfere with NATO enlarging to the whole of Germany. The then Deputy National Security Advisor, and later Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, described the strategy as a means to bribe the Soviets out of Germany. Well, bribe successful. And then, as the simple historical narrative goes, when more Eastern European countries decided that they wanted to do things their own way, and then also wanted Western countries to protect them from Moscow, the Kremlin did not complain. The end. Oh, wait, never mind. Then the invasion of Ukraine happened. Fast forward 4 years, and the situation on the ground looks something like this. Okay, so suppose that Putin falls and a moderate replaces him. Then what? If post-Soviet politics are any guide, a reformer might be willing to withdraw from internationally recognized Ukraine, perhaps sans Crimea, if the price is right. No doubt that the European Union would start raising funds for that purpose in lieu of Ukraine lacking liquidity. But it is hard to see how any of this works without the United States playing a central role in negotiations. Let's say that this does not happen until 2029. If any plausible Democratic nominee wins the 2028 election, they would certainly want to take part in the system. It would be a century-defining moment, and it would also be an opportunity to undo some of the long-term mistakes that the West made while basking in the glow of its Cold War victory. The only problem here is that it will be expensive. This feels worse than the East Germany situation, because that was the outermost part of the Soviet Empire. Eastern Ukraine, by contrast, is a full-fledged part of Russia, according to Federation law. If Marco Rubio is the president in 2029, I also have no doubt that the United States would be willing to pay the necessary amount. If, however, J.D. Vance is the president in 2029, I am not so sure. We know from the leaked signal chats that he falls into the strict isolationist America First camp. It is hard to see how he would be willing to front the necessary money for this program. He would just turn to European leaders, tell them that it is their problem, and have the United States turtle up on the other side of the Atlantic. Brief note about the odds of getting to this point. Vance still leads the Republican nominee markets with a 36% chance. However, Rubio has solidified his position at 25%, arguably being the biggest beneficiary of the Iran war in America. Now, if you are looking at those numbers and asking yourself, what are we doing? What's going on? Then you will be happy to hear that Tucker Carlson is the third most likely Republican nominee, sitting at 7%. Anyway, the whole premise of this video is that the timing of a potential Putin fall matters, and now it should be apparent as to why. I need not tell you that Trump is more of a Vance than a Rubio. If Putin's fall is within the next couple of years, it is hard to imagine that the United States would bankroll an effort to transfer territory back in the hands of Ukraine, especially as the United States no longer pays for equipment to militarily stop Russia from taking more. Now, there are a couple of caveats to that conclusion. 1. Trump likes nothing if not trying to create legacy-defining projects, though they tend not to be so complicated. Take easy wins and try to move on to the next one. Think about the White House ballroom, which will forever be associated with him. While reorganizing Europe might not be as difficult as trying to control Iranian foreign policy, it certainly would not be easy either. Maybe Marco Rubio, in his role as National Security Advisor, could play to Trump's ego and convince him that this is his legacy-defining project. It would make the unpopularity of the Iran war a footnote in history textbooks. So if he needs something to balance out that boondoggle, Ukraine is it. Heck, to sweeten the pot, who knows? Maybe they can rename the Donbass to the Donbass. The other caveat is that this process will take a long time to negotiate. The Berlin Wall fell on November 9, 1989. The last of the Soviet troops, by then actually Russian troops, did not depart Germany until August 31, 1994. So even if Putin departs office tomorrow, there could be a lengthy negotiation process involving Europe that holds the new Russian leader's interest until the next US inauguration. So, what have we learned today? Putin is not likely to be driven from office imminently, but we can at least now talk about the consequences. The next Russian leader is unlikely to up and leave eastern Ukraine. Deals to drive Russia out, though, may be possible. But whether the United States will be willing to pay the requisite price depends on when Putin leaves office. Meanwhile, you can leave this video and dive into one of these two awesome books about the origins of the war. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe. And I will see you next time. Take care.